Thank you. I also have a PowerPoint, short PowerPoint. No? Okay, but it's, well, first, thank you very much for inviting me to participate in these debates. Thanks to the organizers. As a sociologist, I looked through the literature on participation and I noticed two things. First of all, this literature is full of suspicion against this concept. The literature on the powerful, those who actually make the rules, shows that the powerful are wary of really sharing their power because they're afraid of gold drift. I'll give an example later on. There is a sociologist, a famous sociologist called Philip Selznick, who looked at policies of the federal government in the US in the during the crisis in the 1930s, showing that participation promoted by the federal government to develop, for example, the Tennessee Valley Authority ended up miserably, failing miserably because participants were able to change the goals of the administration that was supposed to promote this development. So goal drift, change in the goals. The vulnerable also come to the participatory table because they fear that if they don't participate, if they are not at the table, then they are on the menu. And therefore, but that doesn't change the fact that they fear that participation will be fake, that they will not really have a say, and that they are manipulated into just approving decisions that are already made by the powerful. So therefore, a lot depends on how participation is organized. And an organizational approach, a sociological organizational approach, may be of interest here. So just to make it short, in terms of knowledge about organizations and how they work, I will differentiate between two types of organizations, two ideal typical types of organizations that are nevertheless always combined. The first type is the Weberian bureaucracy. I don't think it's dead. I think it's really developing into something increasingly frightening. Actually, we could come back to this if you want. Bureaucracy is characterized by hierarchy and centralization, by routine tasks, and by impersonal relationships between people cooperating. It operates top-down. At the other end of the continuum, I see another form of organization called collegiality. I call this collegiality. This is collective action among peers, among people who are formally equal. The tasks are not routine, and the relationships between people cooperating need to be personalized between them. Why do they need to be personalized? Because there is no hierarchy to enforce coordination. And personalized relationships in this context are valued enough to become a basis for credible commitment. And this operates bottom-up. Participation requires a combination of both, because participation is political, and politics is always a combination of both. But how are the two combined? So I would like to submit to you the idea of top-down collegiality as a mechanism for the combination of the two models. As you will see, this will be quite close to what Monsieur Dumont called yesterday the Henri IV strategy. Okay. Let me take an example. The other way? Sorry, okay. Let me take an example. Okay. This is taken from the dissertation of Olivier Waterbled, who carried out an organizational analysis of a diocese in France. I thought this would be an interesting example of top-down collegiality because it will give us a good sense of why participation is actually dangerous for people who run the organization. Can be dangerous for everyone in the organization. So this organizational analysis starts with the description of priests' work. And Olivier Waterbled just notices very quickly that priests in a diocese don't just carry out their pastoral activities. They also participate a lot in the administration of their diocese. This is the biggest diocese, one of the biggest dioceses in France. In red, this is a network of, so since their work is really usually not that routine, they actually have functional interdependencies among themselves, and they need each other to carry out their work. And they don't not only have functional interdependencies, but then they have, shall we say, spiritual interdependencies. Keeping the faith is a collective and relational task, work, and so they need each other for this as well, and they need each other for advice, and so on, for many sorts of resources. And this is the advice network among the priests. As you can see, it's quite dense. There's only one priest who is isolated up there on the left, with no advisors and no one seeking advice from him. The interesting thing about in this picture is that you can see that there is a lot of red in the picture. Priests whose node is represented in red are priests who participate in the administrative work of their diocese. So that means that they're involved in the politics of the diocese. This picture maps the fact that they both have personal relationships with each other. They both exchange socially, because advice seeking is a social exchange, and that they participate in collegiality. It is an integral participation in collegiality. Combining the information about the two is also interesting because behind the fact that they participate not only in their pastoral activities but in running their own diocese, there is something deeper than just being good soldiers of the bureaucracy of the diocese. What's behind this are religious orientations of the priests. Priests are professionals. They need to believe in what they're doing in order to carry out their work. And Olivier Waterbled was able to interview them about their orientations, and he identified 5 kinds of orientations in religious work by the priests. One of them is represented in yellow here on the left of the structure. It is the ritualist or the traditionalist orientation. It is described a little more in the paper. It basically, ritualists, for example, say, well, we do our job if we're there for people for our parishioners, when a baby is born, a couple gets married, and someone dies. Okay, so the rituals, we need to be there when people need rituals. The traditionalists, usually they come together. Traditionalists have other ideas about catechism and the way they want the Mass to be said in Latin, and there's a list of characteristics of this orientation. There's another orientation that is stable. These are the intellectuals with responsibilities, pastoral responsibilities in the diocese. These are Jesuits, these are Dominicans, and so they usually have very high degrees, university degrees, and they also do teaching. As you can see, they're in the middle somewhere. And two declining orientations, one of them is called the middle class or oriented towards the independents. They are represented here in blue. There were many more of them in the past, so they're quite numerous here, but it is a declining orientation. And as you can see, the most central nodes in this network belong to that orientation. And a fourth one is brings together militants. That is really, this is the orientation of the prêtre ouvrier, or orientation of people of priests who work in very deprived areas and see their work as being basically the work of politicized social workers, to help the poor, to help the unemployed, claim their rights and cooperate. And in brown, you have the uncommitted. That is, half of the priests do not declare or do not feel that they belong to an orientation. Okay. So what is the strategy of the bishop? The bishop did not answer the questionnaire because the bishop was brand new. So he just arrived, and the biggest node in this network, the most central person, is the vicaire épiscopal, on whom the bishop actually relies to operate, to run the diocese while he is getting acquainted with his priests and with the diocese. Okay, so the strategy of the bishop was the top-down strategy was to actually identify in each of these orientations, this is the Henri IV strategy, identify in each of these orientations the most vocal priests and to bring these priests into the Conseil Épiscopal, the Episcopal Council, to run together the organization, the bureaucratic organization of the diocese. And in exchange for sharing this power, the bishop demanded and obtained that they stop criticizing each other in public. Okay, so they just had to shut up and participate in running the organization. I think that's what you call the Henri IV solution, right? So, okay. Now, this is a good example of the fact that an organization that does not have this top-down collegiality system is in danger of exploding, right? This is when participation is not just a game. Okay, it is the integration of the organization, of a social organization, can depend on it. Okay. Now this, of course, cannot be generalized, right? Because priests speak the same language to some extent. They can refer to a common framework, even if they don't agree on priorities. They live and work in the same diocese, which facilitates the learning process and the creation of personal relationships that are needed for for cooperating among peers. Whether or not these relationships are good or less good. Okay. Nevertheless, the central authority here, the powerful, controls the risk of goal drift by identifying intermediaries. And this is where intermediaries come in. In my view, they're very important. And I think that society has institutionalized intermediaries in professions. And these professions play a big role, it seems to me, when you want to organize participation. Why? Because of the suspicions that participation creates to begin with, among the vulnerable and among the powerful. Researchers have shown that when the vulnerable come to the table to negotiate, to participate, the first thing they want is justice. They want the violence that they are victim of to be recognized. They want their suffering and their anger, they want to show it. And they feel vulnerable because they don't have the experience of negotiation and they don't have the relationships with the other side, the personalized relationships that are needed to actually cooperate as peers. Okay. And this raises, this makes me think of the example of immigration given by Monsieur Dumont yesterday. Okay. It is also a problem of participation. It is also a problem of building a common framework between the majority and the minority. And that is not a problem that is going to go away by just imagining that people will forget their past. Okay, so the idea here is that the weak need, the vulnerable need help, and maybe the powerful as well, because they need relationships and they need the skills and the experience of negotiation. And this help comes from intermediaries who make the top-down collegiality possible, shall we say, the top-down collegiality that makes negotiation quickly possible. And that's the key word, quickly, if that is at all possible. Because intermediaries don't just come in as translators of what people want, on the right? They come in as institutional entrepreneurs. So the whole issue of building new institutions, building new rules, systems of rules, is the real issue of participation. How people are supposed to defend their regulatory interests. And indeed, the intermediaries of the mediator kind, because in network analysis we have many kinds of mediators. But the mediators I'm talking about now are the mediators of the intermediaries are the mediators of the intermediaries of the mediator kind. Because they don't belong to any of the sides. And they're in a position to provide the two resources that are needed here, knowledge and learning and experience on the one hand, networks and relationships on the other. Without those, the commitments that the parties are going to make will not be credible. And these resources will facilitate engaging the other side and possibly find points of agreement. So basically, the point that I'm trying to drive is that participation is a three players game. And that means that intermediaries are usually underestimated and suspected. In France, the ultimate intermediaries are the notaires, not the notaires, the notaries, les notables. Non, pas les notables. Les notaires, oui, also. Les notables, right? Because they are suspected. I don't know if this is a word that exists in other languages. Les notables. They are always suspected of confiscating the definition of the general interests. They are at the meso level. They represent the meso level. And of course, lawyers and priests are also the ultimate professionals and intermediaries. And now we can understand that this, the top-down collegiality developed by the diocese is actually a fantastic organizational solution to make this institution of professional institution of intermediaries last for a very long time. Because you eventually, the intermediary, the third party, takes sides in the negotiation. And it's not difficult to see who is going to take what side in the negotiation between the weak and the powerful when looking at the, religious orientations. But this organization, the organization of the church, manages to make it possible for these professionals, these intermediaries, to live together and to take sides without taking sides while still taking sides. And it's been able to do this organization, for 20 centuries. Okay. So this brings in the issue of the professions, right? What kind of role for the professions and for intermediaries, and it also somehow brings in social stratification in a more complex way. Okay. My conclusion is that we are now in a situation where, especially after Yochai Benkler's presentation this morning, it's impossible to ignore that social networking today provides perhaps new solutions. That is, building relationships with the other side may perhaps, thanks to online social networking and underlying processes, if any, give more power to people who were rejected from the smoke-filled rooms of collegiality to actually open up collegiality to new models, more open collegiality. The truth is, I don't really know if online social networks will be able to change the game, change the three-player game in ways that will make the vulnerable less dependent on, especially on intermediaries. Perhaps it could help accelerate the construction of skills and personalized relationships, especially for the vulnerable. But will it really? I don't know. Perhaps it's a little early to tell. So the conclusion is that an organizational approach provides a methodological perspective for practical and pragmatic participation as a political three-player game. Participation requires long-term personalization of relationships. It requires collective learning processes, and it requires complex three-player games, in which intermediaries are not only translators, but institutional entrepreneurs who can at any time give priorities to their own interests. Perhaps one way of improving this could be to empower the vulnerable, or to, bottom up and top down, and perhaps to peg third parties' privileges and income to more results for the vulnerable. The problem is the third parties are also those who make the laws. So the reality of a participatory society, it seems to me, is that it is already stratified and structured for this political three-player game made possible by top-down collegiality. So my question now is, do we have the time for this kind of change? Does humanity really have the time for this? And hopefully Benkler's solution unlocks the system, but will it really make it obsolete? I really don't know. Thank you.